Now I want to talk a little bit about the grip on the Hoodlum. There's a few things that I find problematic. Some of them you can modify easily, some of them you can modify extensively, and some of them would need a really lot of work in order to modify. One of the first and most immediate ones is that if you try to use the index finger cutout on the blade with a heavy glove, the blade cuts directly into the glove because the index finger cutout is actually relatively small. The other thing is that these ridges and this hump right here prevent a forward grip like this on the blade. Now, I shouldn't say prevent, they just make it very uncomfortable. When you're doing carving work, you don't want to be holding the knife all the way back like this, because the edge of the knife is too far in front of your hand, and while it's alright for light cutting, just whittling off little thin pieces of wood, when you really want to bear down on the blade to get force to remove wood in a hurry, you're fighting a really strong counter torque. And the only thing that does that is your pinking. So in order to minimize the torque, you want to move forward on the blade so that you're pressing down almost right where you're cutting into it, and now there's no torque. The problem is, this thing here and this jimping starts jamming right here into the fleshy part of your hand. Now when you're pressing light, no problem. You're only using about 20 pounds of force. You're only getting about, say, 80 psi or so on the center of your hand. 80 psi is not a lot of pressure. That's the kind of pressure you would feel on your foot if you're walking barefoot on pavement. But if you really ramp up the amount of force, put say between 50 and 100 pounds into this, you're really trying to remove material in a hurry, make some powerful cuts, this starts jamming into your hand. The other thing is, when you're using a really forward grip like this, see where my ring finger is right here? It's jammed right on top of the index finger cutout. In order to get it away from that, you sort of have to splice your fingers out a bit, and because you're trying to move forward, it gets uncomfortable here to have them this far back. In comparison, no such issues on the hungless. This meaty part of your hand makes full contact right here. No problem with the grip. Working around on this works very comfortable in the same sort of area. The other thing I wanted to talk about was that this index finger cutout here in the handle, the main reason this is there is to give the grip extra security. It locks it into place. Your index finger can't ramp up over this. Very secure. The blade won't move this way in your hand. The problem is that only works if you're using a hammer grip. What happens if you use a reverse grip where you're trying to use the knife to hammer into something? Well, now this is again jamming right into your hand, and it's a relatively sharp point. You try to use an ice pick grip, same thing. This digs right into your hand, and even worse, this sort of sharp butt pommel up here now starts digging into your hand. Similar, when you're trying to use side grips to sort of pull cut towards you, again, all these sharp points dig into your hand. Go to something like the hungless or something like the MT151, which has a much more neutrally shaped handle. It doesn't matter what way you grip this. It's perfectly fine. The only thing you can't do is do an overhand grip like what I was saying before, because this jams right into your hand. Now, the other thing that I want to say about the handle is in regarding this index finger cutout. The main purpose of it, again, is to give security in hand. So when you're chopping, when you're doing cutting, this prevents your hand from moving. But the problem is, the way it does this is by exerting a force on your index finger. And your index finger becomes your sole means of grip, because that's what's causing your hand to be locked into place. Your other fingers might as well not be there, and they can't really get much of a purchase on this handle because it's very, very slippery. This is almost polished micarta. In comparison to something like the Hungless achieves the security by having a wider grip profile, by having a gentle swell here, and by having a very large pronounced forward and rear curvature. So you get a same level of retention or comfort. I've never had any issues using the Hungless where I thought this was going to come out of my hand. But because the index finger in this is your sole means of keeping this locked into your hand, that means your index finger takes the brunt. So when you're chopping, when you're cutting, if you're doing draw cuts where you're pulling the blade towards you, you're pulling the blade like this. That means the material exerts a counter force, the exact opposite, which tries to pull the blade forward like this. All that force goes right on your index finger. Now when you're cutting light grasses, you really can't notice it. But as soon as I started to use this on heavier woods, I could feel it on my index finger. That's where the whole focus of the force was, because that's what was keeping it retained in my hand. Now, how much of a difference is that going to make to you? Whether it becomes sort of a nuisance, or uncomfortable, or painful, it's just going to depend on how much work you're going to be doing, how much force you're going to be using, and your general stability of your knuckles and a bunch of other things. But for me, it makes the knife not pleasurable to use. It doesn't cause me that much pain where I wouldn't use it, but if I'm using the Hoodlum and I pick up the Hungless, I don't have any of the issues with my index finger taking those kinds of forces. It's a pleasurable knife to use. I can cut with it, I can slice, I can chop with it, and my hand feels right, no issues whatsoever, and again, it's a pleasurable experience. Now, the other last thing that I want to say, this knife is very, very light and neutrally balanced. It has the exact same weight and balance as the MT151, which is a clone of the Trailmaster from Cold Steel. Now when I'm chopping with the MT151, I hold it by the rear of the handle like this. This puts the balance point significantly in front of my hand, and the knife has enough heft that I can actually bring my elbow into play, and I can get a good deal of power when I'm chopping with it. If I hold it right up like this, it's too light. All I can do is wrist snaps. It's pointless to try to bring my elbow into play. It's too light. I can't hold a Hoodlum like that. The back of this handle here only has enough purchase for 3 fingers. If this handle was extended just a little bit more, I could get a full 4-finger grip back here, and all of a sudden now I'm almost about 2.5 inches now, so my blade is almost 13 inches long. It becomes a nice light machete, and I get a lot more power and swing on it. Now this is where you might make the argument, well hey, why don't you just use a lanyard and tie it onto your hand and do all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's great. The problem is when you're using a partial grip, even if you go back to say 2 fingers and you got it lanyarded on, the knife is going all over the place when you're cutting. If you chop with this and you look at it in relatively slow motion, you see a nice smooth cut where the knife is coming down in a relatively smooth plane. And that means the energy of the swing goes nicely into the cut. When you're basically holding it back like this and flailing it, your knife is going like this. It's going sideways, it's going back and forth, it's going all over the place because you can't get a really secure purchase down here. Even though you get more power, no problem, your accuracy goes down, your efficiency of force transfer goes down, and you end up being right back you were right here, where you might hit it a lot more times with a lot more power, but essentially the power is being wasted because you don't have the accuracy and you don't have the precision, and you're increasing your chance of glancing much more when you're flailing like this compared to where you're doing a full chop like that.